Okay, so I guess we will start our special evening. As I told you this morning, we have this wonderful policy evening starting now. We have to thank the Foundation of European Progressive Studies, for their support, and we don't have one but two professors to talk economics with you. So I have to thank Professor Laszlo Endor for accepting to introduce and to discuss with Paul Collier. So Professor Laszlo Endor is a senior fellow at the Foundation of European Progressive Studies, but he's also working at Corvinus University, and some of you may know him as the former European Commissioner for Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion. So I would like us to welcome Laszlo Endor and to thank him.
Good evening. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. On behalf of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, together with my colleague David Rinaldi, we are also present as some of the sponsors, because this foundation also contributed to the organization of this event. And this session is going to focus particularly on economic policy. Economic policy is about what a government can do, what government should do, or more often today, what government should have done about the functioning of the economy, as opposed to how markets actually function. So this is a very important branch where we believe theory meets practice. And it also has various branches, of course, and it very often deals with systemic questions of the economy, and that's also why I believe that Paul Collier is going to be the most suitable speaker for tonight to raise some fundamental questions of economic policy in this period. He probably doesn't need a long introduction. He's British, which for the time being means that, as you know, the UK is still part of the European Union. We still cherish this relationship, not least because of the quality and the prestige of UK academia and the contribution of British science, especially his own university, Oxford, which is his alma mater. And also he has been associated with Oxford University ever since, apart from working a lot in the context of economic development, especially in Africa. In fact, the first book I read from him was about development, called The Bottom Billion, which was about why exactly some countries fail to develop. And when he wrote that, you know, if the landlocked countries with a lot of corruption, for example, I started to worry because these qualities apply to some in Europe as well, not only in other continents. And that, of course, is an interesting question. To what extent you can create boxes for specific economies, and that some of them Europeans with specific European rules and laws, others developing countries, and they remain in the context of developing countries. And of course, these boxes do not remain there for eternity. There is a lot of dynamic in our world economy, but sometimes the dynamics are not positive but negative, and I think this is highlighted in Paul's most recent book, which is called The Future of Capitalism. This is a topic which we had to think about a lot in the last 10 years, in the last about 6 months, there have been a lot of discussions about the great financial crisis, or the greatest financial crisis since World War II, or as I think you can also say, the mother of all financial crises, which we have experienced. And by the way, we just read some remarkable papers which were analyzing the crisis and the crisis response from the point of view of the financial sector, and why we failed to not just understand what was going on, but why we failed to foresee. And this is, I think, a very important point, since I think there is an expectation from society towards public economists, political economists, which is at least a little bit to predict what might come. Maybe not for 100% details, but to give reliable estimates about the economic implications of various directions of economic, social, political development. And that's also, in a way, a quality of economists which was put to the test 10 years ago, before and at the time of the financial crisis, and altogether we didn't receive the best assessment of this. And on the top of that, as you know, the European Union, and especially the so-called euro area, went through not one recession, but 2 recessions, which nearly disintegrated the whole structure of this monetary union and the European Union. So we do have a lot to think about the various layers of this crisis, whether it is only about the finance, whether it's a real economy, or it's a more complex crisis of the society and the value systems. So there's a lot of there are a lot of possibilities about reflecting about the nature of the crisis. In fact, we just met with Professor Collier a few weeks ago in Berlin, which was a major conference for reflection of think tanks of the world, with a lot of experts coming together, how to improve global governance. This is actually one of the products of this crisis. Previously, there was no such a forum to coordinate world economic developments like we have today, the so-called G20. It's not a global government, but it's a form of global coordination and reflection, which is now also supported by a lot of expert groups also coming together in a formalized way in meetings of think tanks. Now, sometimes when there is a perception of failure, of course, some people say, we're not interested in experts, or we had enough of experts. We had this notion at the time of the pre-referendum Brexit debates, but I think most of the time the expertise is respected by policymakers, not least because if you look at who is actually making economic policy, in most of the cases, it's not economists, right? Most of the leading economic posts are filled by politicians coming from a variety of professions. If you just look at, for example, G7, previously G8, finance ministers, very often there is 0 economists on that level. I think in the recent period, the distinguished Italian economist Pier Carlo Padoan was the only one with a proper economics background to fill such a position at that high level. But it makes it even more important that economists provide sound analysis, the clarity of options for policymakers, out of which they have the possibility to choose. So it's very important that politicians actually listen. So that's the whole, that's the essential point in this interface between economic science and policy making. But it's very important that we present our views in a way that politicians understand. Now, this brings me to the title of the lecture which is coming: Identity, Obligation and Purpose, the New Economics of Group Behavior. Raise your hand if you understood the title. Not everybody, right? So, Paul, the floor is yours. Please explain the title, and we are eager to listen.
Thank you very much. Thanks. That's great. Okay, so that was a good that was a good ending question. What on earth is this title about, right? And I thought it would be actually more fun for you. This might prove to be wrong. To hear a non-conventional opening keynote rather than just yet another economics lecture with a load of slides and PowerPoint stuff. So there's no PowerPoint, right? You're just going to have to listen. And it's quite a radical thesis that I'm going to be putting out. Just let me say a word or two about myself. I started out doing a doctorate in economic theory, purest of pure theory, and then I moved into very applied economics, the economics of Africa, and gradually from that to applications to economic policy, more and more applications to economic policy. So most recently I've been working with the German government on their presidency of the G20, and we came up with a whole program of approach to Africa called the Compact with Africa, which I might circle back to at the end of the lecture. But after this long phase of working on Africa, that gave me a load of ideas, which then started to inform my view of what was going wrong in our own societies. And Laszlo, as you suggested, there isn't one box which has poor countries in it and another box which has rich countries in it. The same phenomena, the same forces are at work in both. And because I spent 40 years working on the forces that have kept poor countries very poor, I start to see the incipient signs of that creeping into the advanced, so-called advanced societies, right? And we know it's possible for societies to go down as well as up, right? So the theory that I'll be sketching and drawing on is what George Akerlof describes as behavioral economics 2.0. Right? You all know behavioral economics. You know, we're hardwired with stupid biases that make us very bad at calculating risks and things like that. Right? Individual hardwired biases. Right? That's not very interesting, frankly. Right? The much more interesting stuff is the soft-wired biases. Soft-wired, not in individuals, but soft-wired in groups. And because they're soft-wired, you can wire very different things into different groups, depending on what ideas are circulating. And so the behavior in one group can depart a lot from the behavior in another group. Right? That is much more interesting than hardwired biases we've all got. Right? So that's what behavioral economics 2.0 is trying to do. It's trying to look at the soft-wired biases that circulate in groups. Right? They're not necessarily biases, they're ideas. So that's what I'll be trying to draw on. And just before I dive into the detail of that, I want to sketch what I regard as the big intellectual divide, and that's between ideologies and pragmatism. And I am a very strong believer in pragmatism. What pragmatism, the founding ideas of pragmatism, goes back a long way, it goes to Hume, is that there are no fundamental tenets of society which are permanently true and from which we can derive a load of other permanent truths. Right? Pragmatism sees society as evolving in ways that are too complex for us to accurately predict. And so the best we can do is to understand a society in its current context try and understand how it's broadly working at the moment, and then use our understanding for a provisional prediction, right? And that provisional prediction will work okay for a while, but then society will evolve away from that to some area where the predictions don't work very well, right? But that's the best you can do, right? So it's a constant attempt to try and understand the context here and now and what's going on, and recognizing that all your theories will work for a while. They're approximations to something that is beyond reach, right? So that's pragmatism. Ideology, very different kettle of fish, right? Marxism, fundamentalism, whatever, right? And they keep blowing up, right? I start with that because it's very important that economics doesn't become an ideology, right? Economics has to be an empirical subject which is about behavior. And behavior is so incredibly complex that we're never going to get fully on top of it, right? We can make approximations. We've got one. It's called economic man. Right? Economic man directly observes the world and has a very, very simple utility function. It's greedy, is selfish, and is lazy, right? And astonishingly, for a lot of applications, that's good enough. It's a good enough approximation, right? But for a lot of applications, it's a terrible approximation, right? And so you've got to learn in what contexts that is good enough, because it's dead. It's these big advantages. It's really simple. People are maximizing something that's dead simple against a known world, an objective reality, right? So it'll give us very clear results, but they'll only be right, or approximately right, good enough, in a limited domain in which those assumptions are not so ridiculous that they'll blow up, right? But what's happened is, economics has become a very imperial subject, and so it's ranged all over the place into wider and wider domains of application, and it's crept into areas where that model of human behavior is so bad that it's really dangerous, right? And that's what's happened. What I'm going to be doing is departing from that economic man, right? So I'm going to have social man, right? Usually I call it social woman, but then people think it's about women. It's not. It's just to say it's going to be different, right? And social man is going to be still maximizing, but the stuff that's in the utility function is going to change, going to be different. And what they know is going to be different from the objective reality. So just to persuade you that that's not so crazy as to be ridiculous, 2 days ago, Oriana Bandiera got the Janssen Prize for her work on trying to rethink the utility function to introduce social preferences into the utility function, right? So she's already torn up economic man, the idea that we're just greasy, selfish, lazy, right? No, right? In a domain, that's fine, but in a much larger domain, it isn't, right? So Oriana has a very nice review of the evidence in the Annual Review of Economics 2017, and I recommend it. And for example, she shows evidence that people care about other people in a team. They compare themselves with other people in the team. It can work adversely and favorably, right? They try and do things which help other people in a team, but if some other people in the team get a pay rise that they don't get, then they feel that's unfair, that's demotivating, and so they work quite a lot less hard. Right? So there's a result which shows that they're sort of inherently social. But that result, which I've just described to you, which incidentally was QJE 2018, so people are now publishing in this area of social preferences. One of the curiosities they found was that, so if your pay didn't change, but other people in your group got quite a big pay rise, you worked a lot less hard, right? That result, but that entire result went away if, as well as the firm raising the pay of others and not raising yours, it came up with a plausible justification. Right? Now, what's that? A plausible justification? What does that mean in economics, a plausible justification? Right? Oriana doesn't know. She just says, it's interesting. But it doesn't fit in her framework. It certainly doesn't fit in Economic Man either. Right? So what I'm going to be trying to do is sketch a framework in which you could actually make sense of results like that. Right? Just to give you one little quote from Oriana's conclusion. She says, research on social preferences is in its infancy. And individuals behave very differently in the same public goods game depending on how it's framed. What does it mean, how it's framed? It means things like that. Language which gives a justification, right? And at the moment, economics has really not got any handle on how utterances of language should make a blind bit of difference if the payoff function isn't altered. But we know it does make a big difference, right? So that's the challenge. So how do we make sense of results like that plausible justification substantially changes people's behavior? And for that, we're going to have to do two things, quite savage things, to poor old Economic Man. Right? One is we're going to have to unbundle his preferences. This whole notion of preferences has been, in my view, a very sort of cop-out fudge in which we've thrown in far too much. In particular, economics has not made a distinction between wants and oughts. So I'm going to make a distinction between wants and oughts. Wants may well be hardwired. If we didn't want to eat, we'd all be dead. And so evolution has ensured that we crave to eat. But oughts, where on earth do they come from? And I'm going to argue that oughts are not hardwired as cravings like I want to eat. They are socially constructed. And now, to get a handle on how things like oughts are socially constructed, we're going to have to accept another big change from Economic Man. Economic Man just directly observes the objective reality, right? But I don't think Social Man does that at all. Actually, Social Man would be bloody stupid to directly observe reality. Social Man only has two eyes, whereas if we get part of a group and listen to what other people tell us, we've got the knowledge of many eyes from a whole history of experience. So the idea that we directly observe the world and work it all out for ourselves, it sounds right until you think about it. It's certainly not the process that any of us went through. We weren't born as rational, fully observant adult human beings. Right? We were all born as completely dependent beings. right? And we spend years in that state. And the group that we're born into, grow up with, they feed us ideas, which I'll come to in more detail later, but they create our mind. We're born with a brain. That is an individual endowment. But our mind is a social construct. Right? The mind is the distinction between the hardwired brain and the ideas that fill up the mind. Right? And clearly our behavior is driven by minds, not just by brains. And so we're going to be maximizing subject to the ideas that people have fed us. Right? And some of those ideas might be accurate portrayals of the real world, the objective reality, and some might not. Right? There is no equivalent in the world of ideas to the hidden, to the invisible hand in the market. Right? The invisible hand guides us into society, into correct resource allocation, subject to this and that. Right? There's no equivalent process that guides the ideas in people's heads to be a correct mapping of objective reality. Right? None at all. Right? That's a very obvious statement if you look at the world, but it's a sort of grim truth. So that's the world that economics, I think, needs to go to, a world in which, for a lot of purposes, not for all, but for a lot of purposes, we stop trying to predict things on the base of economic man, and we move to predictions on the basis of social man, who has a utility function which is, to an extent, a social utility function. So it's not just greed, yes, but selfish by no means necessarily, and also by no means necessarily lazy. Right? I know several billionaires, and economic man would predict that they just lie on a beach all day. Right? The billionaires I know are complete driven workaholics. Some are in their 80s, and they work a 16-hour day, and not for themselves. Right? I'll make one, since I've got a couple of minutes, I'll make a dangerous analogy. And this is, you know how economics is all sort of fixated on physics envy. But the sort of physics it envies is a very, very old-fashioned physics. I mean, the physics we envy is actually Newtonian physics, where everything's super predictable, and little economic man is like a billiard ball, you know, ping. And so it's, our image of physics is basically Newtonian physics, but Newtonian physics went up in smoke over a century ago. Right? Everything is quantum. Right? And quantum physics has ideas, actually, the big three ideas that I take from quantum physics, this is not from my reading, this is from academic physicists in Oxford who tell me. Right? The big three ideas in quantum physics are that things only exist in relationships. So the fundamental notion is relationships. And the second thing is packages, that's quanta. Things are glued together. Right? So relationships, irreducible packages, and radical uncertainty. There's domains that you cannot predict. Right? And as it happens, purely by chance, those are three features which turn out to be very handy when you start thinking about social man. Right? It's, relationships are going to be central. ideas will cluster together in packages that fit together. And we'll be stuck with radical uncertainty. What do we know? What do we know about the brain, and what do we know about the mind? And this is bits of neuroscience and bits of evolutionary biology and bits of psychology. So what do we know about the brain? We know that humans have evolved to be greedy, but not particularly selfish, because for about 500,000 years, early man could only survive in groups. I mean, that's why, you know the Dunbar constant? How many people can tell me what's the number in the Dunbar constant?
20.
150, right? You don't know the Dunbar constant, right? Economists do need to know enough from other social science disciplines. Dunbar constant is how many people you can actually meaningfully know. About 150. Apes, it's about 40. So through the evolutionary process, the maximum social group that you could cope with rose from being 40 in apes to 150 in human beings. Why? Because human beings moved out of the trees into environments where you needed larger groups in order to function, to be safe. But managing large groups is very, very, very demanding. And the latest theory of why did our brains expand, our brain size tripled. Why did our brain size triple? Because of the demands of sociability. So we are hardwired for sociability. That's why we've got big brains. It's not for the individual capacity to take decisions. It's for the capacity to be able to interact with the group that's big enough to give you environmental security. So we're hardwired, as a consequence of that, to belong to groups. We crave to belong to groups. And within those groups, we crave the esteem of other members of the group. So our utility function, at a minimum, has to have not only I'm greedy, I want to consume, but I want to belong to a group, and I want the esteem of other people in the group. Right? So you've got basically two other terms in the utility function. The branch of economics which does all that is called identity economics. It was pioneered by George Akerlof and Rachel Cranton. There's a nice, accessible little book called Identity Economics. And there's an association called Economic Research on Identities, Norms, and Narratives, ERIN, which is doing all this. Hardwired belong, hardwired for esteem, and hardwired for reciprocity. And we know the chemical that induces reciprocity, that's oxytocin, and we know how it evolved to do that. Because in other species, oxytocin is just used to bond mothers to their children, to their babies. Right? So in other species, that's why they release oxytocin. And in humans, that evolved over the course of 1 million years to a larger purpose, which is bonding within the social group. And the amazing thing about why we're hardwired for reciprocity is that in humans, the release of oxytocin is reflexive. So if I decide, oh, Laszlo's a good guy, and I emit oxytocin, which makes me feel you're a good guy, then your brain senses that oxytocin, and you release oxytocin too, and look at me, and you feel, oh, Paul's a good guy. You know? So we're hardwired for reciprocity. Right? Now, so that's the brain. Now what do we know about the mind? Remember, the mind is a social construct. And we know that our unique evolutionary advantage over other species is one thing: language. The ability to use complex language. Right? And complex language has enabled us to do two things which are fundamental to human progress. One, which is in the individual. Because we've got language, we can imagine future scenarios other than the present. Right? That was Wittgenstein's insight. Right? With language, you can imagine hypothetical future scenarios. And without language, you can't. Right? I've got a dog. Right? Maybe you've got it. Right? The dog is very good at knowing what it wants here and now, right? But it can't sit there and think, if only Paul did this and then, you know, it can't do that, if only this and then and blah. So that's one thing that language does. Without the capacity to imagine future scenarios, we would be stuck in a perpetuation of the present as all other species are. Right? There would be no progress. And the other thing that language does is enable us to communicate in a group, so a group which shares the language and which circulates narratives in that network. And the language that is most powerful is narrative language. And we know why. This is Paul Zak, the neuroscientist at San Diego, I think. Narratives are much, much easier for us to remember and to engage with. Right? A point which economics lecturers ought to bear in mind now and then, right? What can narratives circulating in a network do? It's very important that they circulate in a network and that some nodal actor broadcasts them. Because only if everybody hears the same message do we get what's called common knowledge. You're familiar between the distinction between private knowledge, shared knowledge, and common knowledge. Right? Private knowledge, I know it, you don't. Asymmetric information, right? Shared knowledge, no asymmetric information, I know it and you know it. Common knowledge, I know that you know it and you know it, that I know it, and I know it, that you know that I know it, right? Infinite regress. Right? What we can show through experimental work is that only when you move from shared knowledge to common knowledge do you crack the coordination problem that's needed for common action. Right? Okay, so we've got language which enables us to imagine alternative futures and which provides a mechanism for coordination. We all know we all have the same ideas. Right? What can we do with that? Well, we can generate 3 ideas which form a package. Right? So we've now gone from relationships to packages. Right? And the three ideas that form a package, one is narratives of group identity. We are all a shared identity. Right? That's a narrative of identity. Right? You create a we, right? A defined we, the people in this room. Right? Second is a causal proposition. If we all did this, so imagined future scenarios, if we all did this, then this would happen. Right? Now, suppose it's something that's an improvement, you know? if we all went for a drink, we'd all be better off than standing here listening to this guy drone on, right? So that's a causal proposition where if only we all did it, we'd all be better off, right? And then the third narrative is a normative proposition, you know, and it's the reciprocity narrative. If you do it, I'll do it. You know? If I do it, you should do it, right? And that's a package which does fit together, right? One of the things that makes us a group is that we are the group which, if we all did this, we'd all be better off. That we have a common purpose, right? And you need that we to define the domain of reciprocity. Right? So you've got to have a bounded shared we that defines where the domain over which the reciprocity applies. And what binds that package together is purpose. It's a sense of forward-looking common purpose. Yeah? Purpose is fundamental to human behavior. And economics has somehow missed out on it. It just wants to say, oh, it's a preference or something. Right? People are not really utility maximizers. They're purpose-driven. Right? You can call that utility maximizing, but you don't add anything by dropping utility in, really. Now, as a result of being purpose-driven, humans are capable of being morally load-bearing. That is to say, we're capable of accepting oughts. So that creates a tension between what we want to do, our hardwired cravings, and these socially constructed constraints on hardwired cravings. I want to do this, but there's an ought. Right? And that tension we've now got, because we've got a social animal, not just a greedy individual, selfish maximizer. Let me give you an example of social. This is a social psychology result, and for most of you, it won't. In an older audience, I recommend that they try it. They try it on themselves at night. You have to be alone, and it's quite painful. If you're young, it's not painful, right? And here's what you have to do. So you have to write down your 3 biggest regrets in life. Right? And the older you get, the more painful it gets, believe me. Right? And then the social psychologists just group them up, classify them. You know? All these regrets are in one bucket, all these regrets are in another bucket. Right? So what bucket is full and what bucket is empty? Right? It's quite clear if we're all economic man, it's quite clear what bucket will be full, right? You know, if only I hadn't messed up that interview with Goldman Sachs, if only I'd bought Apple shares, if only I'd bought that house, right? They don't feature, we've all got regrets like that, sort of, but they don't make it into the top 3, right? The bucket that gets full is, I let down my mother, you know? I let down my partner, I let down my colleague. They're breaches of obligations. They hurt. And because they hurt, we learn better not do them. You know, better try and keep our obligations. Otherwise, you feel a shit for the rest of your life. Right? So, we're morally load-bearing. But most of our purposes in life need groups bigger than an individual. And that's why we've built organizations that are much larger than ourselves. We build families with a set of purposes. We build firms with a set of purposes. And we build governments with a set of purposes. And I want to say a little bit about firms with purposes, because my colleague Colin Mayer, who's Oxford's Professor of Finance and former Dean of our business school, has written a companion book to mine. So mine is The Future of Capitalism. His is called Prosperity, and it's about firms. And its thesis is that firms basically have to return to a world of purpose. And Colin traces the history of corporations over 2,000 years and shows that in all but the last 60, corporations were designed to be purposive. Purpose is larger than profit. Right? If you're a corporation, you need to make a profit, otherwise you're not sustainable. But profit isn't your purpose, it's a constraint on purpose, on fulfilling purpose. Right? And he shows that it's only this last 60 years that there's been this hideous detour into the function of the only purpose of the firm is to make a profit, which came out of Milton Friedman. Right? Very few people now are willing to stand up and say the sole purpose of the firm is to make a profit, actually. It's gone. Right? And you don't have to take it from me. If you read yesterday's paper, Jamie Dimon, the chief executive of JP Morgan, the biggest of the world's banks, came out with a 50-page letter saying every business has to have a purpose beyond profit. Right? Larry Fink, head of BlackRock, 4 trillion assets under management. He sends out one annual letter in January. And this year, what it said to all the companies that he holds these 4 trillion in, you must have a purpose, a stated purpose, and it can't be profit. Right? Klaus Schwab, head of Davos, same thing. Right? What was Davos about this year? Every company has to have a purpose beyond profit. So, economics, these are the high priests of capitalism, those three. Right? Economics should not be more Catholic than the Pope. Right? We shouldn't be asserting that the sole purpose of the firm is profit. Right? But that's what we did. That's what we did for 60 years. It's possible to build these pyramids of reciprocal obligations. Nodal actors who communicate to everybody in a network can do that. A good example of a truly awful organization that grew very, very successfully by that means is ISIS. What was ISIS other than a nodal actor communicating shared identity, common purpose, normative proposition? The package. Right? The package around a purpose, which had such powerful effects. It's subject to 3 constraints. You can't just say anything. It's got to be credible. And this takes us back to that phrase, a plausible justification. Right? Plausible justification. Right? So there's a zone of credibility. If you've said this, or rather if you've done this, there's only a zone within which explanations or justifications will be credible. Right? Economics already got a ready-made theory, a very good one, of how actions create zones of credibility. It's called the theory of signaling. It's Mike Spence, Nobel laureate. Right? So we've got a whole ready-made theory sitting there about how you create, with visible actions, a zone of credibility. And what's been missing is a theory of what's called speech acts, performative language, which provides an explanation, a rationale. Language is much better than actions at precision of meaning. But you can't have a precise meaning over here and an action that creates credibility there. Right? So the action will create a zone within which any explanation will be accepted. Right? I've got one more significant idea, and then I want to try and... no, I haven't. I can go straight into as many applications as I can get away with in the next 15 minutes. Right? So my first application is back to what has been my life's work, basically. Why are some countries poor and other countries very, very much richer? And why are those poor countries stayed poor? Right? And of course, there's a very fashionable explanation which has been around the last 10 years or so. It's all institutions. Right? And institutions matter. I don't want to say they don't matter, but they're only part of the story. Institutions, Douglas North came up with a very confusing sentence which said institutions are the rules of the game. And if you think about it, that's not right. Right? Rules are the rules of the game. Right? Laws and things like that are right down. Institutions are organizations run by people, teams of people. And the behavior of the institution depends not just on what does it say on the box, what it's supposed to do, it depends on the ideas in people's heads. You know, when Britain decolonized, every one of its former colonies got pretty well identical institutions, and they all went all different ways because they were staffed by people with very different ideas in their heads. So let me contrast a well-functioning society with a badly functioning society. What are the ideas in people's heads? And I'm going to show a very bizarre property of these ideas and how they relate to economic outcomes. So in a well-functioning society, you've got this triple of people believe that the world is a positive-sum game, and so there's some point in cooperating. Right? Cooperation makes sense because the world's a positive-sum game. They also believe in a forward-looking proposition of the form, if we all do this, this will make things better. So they're forward-looking, right? Purposive, forward-looking, common purpose. Right? And thirdly, they accept that they're agents that with shared responsibilities, that if you exercise that agency, this will happen. So you've got agency, both individually and collectively. You can determine you can shape the outcomes that you will experience. Now, if you hold those three beliefs, what sort of economy do you get? Well, you get growth, because the basic forward-looking proposition is, let's sacrifice now and we'll all be better off. So sure enough, you are better off, right? The world makes some sort of sense. You expected something to happen, and lo and behold, it did. Right? And so it's predictable. Right? And finally, you indeed have distributed agency. You did something, others did something. Right? Now, here's the peculiar property. What ideas do those outcomes generate? And the key point is that there's an ergodic relationship between the ideas and the economic outcomes. Ergodic means one thing maps into the other. Okay? The ideas map into the economic outcomes, we've just seen that, but equally, the economic outcomes validate and therefore refresh, confirm the ideas. Yeah? The world's growing, and so, sure enough, it's a positive-sum game. Yeah? By making a sacrifice, good stuff happened. It was predictable. Yeah? And you demonstrated that you have agency. The societies I work in, and have worked in for such a long time, don't have those ideas. They have a different set of ideas. Most people see, or I don't want to generalize too much, but people see life as a zero-sum game. There's not much point in cooperating if life is a zero-sum game. They see their best strategy as being opportunistic. If an opportunity comes along, snatch it. Right? You don't forward plan, just snatch things as they arise. And finally, there's not much of a belief in agency, in the power of your own agency or the agency of the people around you. You see yourself as a victim. Right? So zero-sum game, snatch opportunism and victimhood. What sort of outcomes does that produce? Well, it produces stagnation, it produces unpredictability, chaotic environments, and it produces a society in which rewards just reflect the imbalances in power. And so that is also ergodic. If the reality that you've lived with for 40 or 50 years is stagnation, as the poor societies on which I work have indeed experienced, the natural assumption is that the world is zero-sum. What's the point in cooperating if the economy is stagnant? Not only is the economy stagnant, it'll be subject to a lot of shocks, it'll be chaotic, and so planning a long time forward, looking at these collective forward-looking visions is bloody stupid. Right? The world's chaotic, snatch opportunities if they present themselves. Right? And then, what outcomes have you suffered? You've been a victim, you're at the wrong end of a power relationship. Right? So your best hope is to get at the right end of a power relationship. So to the extent that you cooperate, it's in subgroups to fight other groups. Right? Okay, so much for the poor countries relative to the rich ones. Let me do a quick detour into Trump, Brexit, and the Gilets jaunes, which is what this is all about. All right? So this is a 2-minute guide to the book. It doesn't absolve you from reading it. Right? The thesis is that, or part of the thesis, is that two economic forces, which are not very difficult to comprehend, the forces of globalization and the forces of rising complexity. Rising complexity is the price you pay for rising productivity. So globalization and complexity have created two new rifts in our societies. And one rift is a spatial rift. The big agglomerations, Brussels, London, Paris, New York, they're doing really well. Because with globalization, there's room for fewer, bigger winners. Right? And then periodically, the provincial cities in the OECD have got knocked out. The global winner has shifted elsewhere, which is what happened to my own hometown of Sheffield. If you've seen the film The Full Monty, that's Sheffield, right? That were my relatives, right? So that's the spatial rift, agglomerations versus the provinces. And the other is the educational rift, right? Between the people who've got the education like yourselves to get the specialist skills needed by the new complexity versus the people who hadn't got so much education, invested in manual skills, and they are becoming less valuable, partly by globalization, partly by the new complexity, right? Becoming redundant skills. And these two are related because the skilled people go to the metropolis where they've got the highest pay, and so you've got a metropolitan elite doing very well. And that group then peels off from shared identity. I've got a new model just coming out in Oxford Economic Papers, which shows how the rational, utility maximizing, esteem maximizing person would do that. They jump out of shared identity with everybody else. Right? And as they jump out of shared identity, they jump out of shared obligations. That's resented by the people at the other end of the line, the provincial less educated, and so what they do is mutiny. Right? Like all mutinies, Brexit and Trump and the Gilets jaunes were not forward-looking. Right? I mean, the Gilets jaunes quite manifestly, quite publicly say, we don't have a strategy. We just know what's wrong. Right? We just know we've been ignored. Right? I've got time for one last one, and that's the power of narratives as coordinating mechanisms for overcoming radical uncertainty. Okay? So we're back to narratives. The radical uncertainty is a corollary of accepting pragmatism. We don't know enough to be able to see the world as entirely predictable. And so we also know that if we are subject to a decision which is subject to radical uncertainty, we are ambiguity averse. Yeah? There was a debate in economics for quite a while as to whether we had to take ambiguity aversion seriously, because it's such an inconvenience, if you want to just use economic man. Right? Economic man isn't ambiguity averse. And so the argument went, well, ordinary people are a bit stupid, and so they're ambiguity averse, but the big people who make the big economic decisions, and they're not ambiguity averse. That was the postulate as to why you could ignore ambiguity aversion, except just late last year in the Economic Journal is a test of that. And very inconveniently, it finds that actually the more sophisticated the economic actor, the more ambiguity averse they are. Right? So we have to take ambiguity aversion seriously. We have to take radical uncertainty seriously. And how psychologically do people get out of that? Well, the head of the Complex Decisions Center at UCL in London, University College London, is a neuroscientist who's come up with the proposition that it's narratives which do it. Right? Narratives circulating in a group, people persuade themselves that it's right. Everybody else thinks it, so it must be right. And so narratives become the way out of the ambiguity. We actually understand what's happening, so it's no longer radical uncertainty. We've got a theory. Huh? Akerlof and Schiller, their account of the 2008 crisis. The story is the story. Huh? That's what that's the punchline of Akerlof and Schiller. The story circulating in the financial community, that was what created the crisis. It was a false story, but everybody believed it. Huh? Now, I'm going to end with one peculiar domain in which narratives have a very peculiar property, and that is the domain of location and spatial economics. And the location might be a poor country, might be a poor city, might be a successful city. Okay? And the peculiar feature of narratives as coordinating devices in the domain of location is that over a very wide range, they are self-fulfilling. What is uncertain is, will this city thrive? Will this city not thrive? Or this country? What will it depend upon? Future investment decisions of lots of firms, because what matters nowadays is there going to be a cluster. Those are intrinsically unknowable. The decisions haven't been taken yet. That's the radical uncertainty. But a narrative, what was the narrative that set in Singapore? Singapore is growing like topsy. Right? What do you do if you think a city is growing like topsy? Huh? You invest because it's pretty safe. And then what happens to the city? It grows like topsy. Huh? The countries I work on, what are they? What's the narrative? They're basket cases. What does a basket case mean? It means we don't even need to understand why it's a mess. We just know there's something about it, which means it'll always be a mess. That's the narrative. And so guess what? It stays a mess. Huh? Can narratives be changed? This is my last 30 seconds. Here's the example in Europe, Bilbao. Bilbao, up to 1998, was basket case city. It was a broken industrial town, and on top of that, it had Basque violence. Huh? So it was full Monty plus violence. Huh? And then what happened in 1998? A piece of infrastructure which, if the British Treasury had run it through its cost-benefit analysis, would have come out as costs up there, benefits zero. Right? What piece of infrastructure got built in Bilbao in 1998? Anybody know? Guggenheim. Yeah. Right? I learned of it because I just joined the World Bank as the director of the research department, and I discovered our president, President Wolfenson, was making a trip to Spain. Why did he go to Spain? Because he wanted the Spanish government to take him to Bilbao, because it was the city of the future. Right? What happened? Bilbao is now thriving. Right? So this useless piece of infrastructure coordinated on a new narrative. So narratives can be changed. Now, I've finished. I hope in the process that I've not driven you nuts, that I've persuaded you. This is actually an interesting, pretty new line of work that you can be the next recipient, or 10 years' time, of the Janssen Prize with the next step forward in the psychology of groups. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Paul, for the ride through social science and the brief introduction to your book, and of course also to Laszlo for the kind introduction and Fabs for making this session happen. We have time for some questions if you want to address them to Paul. We have the first mic there, and then I get you.
So thank you very much for this very nice talk. I was wondering, so I was waiting for the whole talk for one word, which I didn't hear, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on the role of this particular aspect, which was the role of technology in the different aspects that you were mentioning. So the evolution, the propensity of people to form groups, to communicate, information asymmetry, and all those things. So do you have any thoughts on the role of technology in some of the aspects you mentioned?
Yeah, so technology has clearly affected how we communicate with each other, right? Very much so. And has made communication with others very much easier. And so, the people who introduced it thought they were saving the world, because now we would be able to form these huge networks. Anybody could connect with anybody, so everybody could connect with everybody. Hasn't happened, really, has it? I mean, to date, what has tended to happen is homology. Homology is the force that says we like to be with people like ourselves. And so what the new electronic social networks has tended to do is shift the composition of the Dunbar constant is hardwired. We can't know more than about 150 people, no matter what technology we have, right? My teenager's got 2,000 likes, friends on Facebook or something, right? That's just a load of bullshit, right? At best, it's 150, right? What social networks looked like before technology was, to an extent, the randomness of shared location. It was spatial, so you knew 150 people around you. And those 150 people might agree with you, and they might disagree with you, right? But now, you can choose those 150 people, and you make damn sure that they agree with you because it's more comfortable that way. Right? And that, I think, has tended to produce this segregation and the polarization. We used to get the segregation between countries because it was so much harder to communicate between countries than within them. And so the ideas were very different between countries, but fairly similar within countries. And now we've got these big differences within countries, and they're proving to be, pretty hard to manage because you need that sense of the big we in order to have a domain of common purpose. You need big we, common purpose, and then the reciprocal and the confidence that people will accept reciprocal obligations. If they hate each other, they won't accept reciprocal obligations. I see in my own society, Brexit has made things even worse because now the society is divided down the middle and the real hatred's forming. So the attempt to get a forward-looking common purpose has got harder. Right? Now, hopefully it doesn't have to be like that, but that's the technology's leapt ahead of the analysis of how it's going to actually play out. The people managing the technology have lost this sense of purpose beyond profit, or to the extent that they have a sense of purpose beyond profit, they're so socially stupid that they've not thought it out properly. They're naive. They're tech wizards and social idiots.
Yes, so I guess we cannot build a Guggenheim museum in each African town. So what are your policy recommendations for low-income countries?
For Africa?
For Africa.
Yeah, sure. So let's build on that sort of Bilbao point. In a way, we need to change the narrative. A lot of African societies are seen as basket cases, or words to that effect. And the consequence is they've got what African countries are desperately short of is proper firms. Proper firms perform the miracle of productivity. They do so in their sleep. The miracle of productivity is just scale and specialization, right? You bring ordinary people together, you get scale, and you get this lot to do that, and that to do that, and that makes them massively more productive. This is Adam Smith and the pin factory, right? And Africa is still desperately short of organizations that do that little miracle. Right? Most Africans work solo. 2/3 of Africa's human capital is tied up in solo enterprises. Right? Scale zero, specialization zero, doomed to low productivity. Right? So what Africa desperately needs is more firms. Right? Who's got the firms? We have. Right? What Africa desperately needs is for the firms that populate the OECD to set up operations in Africa, and then those will get imitated. Think of it, the classic example is Bangladesh, where one foreign firm stumbles into Bangladesh in 1980 and starts making textiles. It's not very good at it, doesn't know how to function in Bangladesh. But at the end of the first year, half the labor force quits, not because they're bad jobs, but because they say, oh, these managers are idiots. They don't know how to operate in Bangladesh, but we do. And so they set up their own garment firms. You roll on from 1980 to now, 4 million people employed, mainly young women, which has changed gender relations in Bangladesh, very much for the better, and a $30 billion export industry each year. So that was catalyzed by one foreign firm that stumbled in. and there's evidence from Turkey that when foreign firms come in, they actually raise the productivity of local firms because local firms imitate stuff. So it's not that Africa just needs foreign firms, it needs its own firms, but it will get its own firms by a process of imitation. Now, this is the sort of idea I managed to get the German government to accept in 2017. They brought me in wanting an initiative on Africa, and they sort of asked me to help design it. And so we devised this thing called Compact with Africa, which was based on 3 principles. I had a dinner with Chancellor Merkel and Minister of Finance and the Economic Cabinet. I said, there's 3 principles. 1, don't preach. Chancellor Merkel looked absolutely mystified, actually, but she did have the decency to write it all down. So don't preach. Right? Africans are so sick of Europeans preaching to them. Right? 2nd, don't threaten. Right? Don't say, unless you do what we want you to do, nasty stuff will happen. Right? And 3rd, don't bribe, in the sense of don't say, we'll give you money if you do what we want you to do. So what was the Compact with Africa? It's just set out possibilities for those African governments that want to take them. The whole approach was to try and bring firms in. And so African governments were invited to do things that would make the business environment better, and willing G20 governments committed to trying to use their development finance institutions, like IFC, to use public money to bring them there. And so that was the structure. And there are about 12 governments in Africa that have said we like this, and 4 of them are really stuff's happening. And that is Senegal, Ghana, Ethiopia, and Rwanda. And if those 4 countries get ahead, significantly ahead, that's great. That's exactly what happened in East Asia. 4 little countries got ahead, including Singapore, and Deng Xiaoping went to Singapore and was persuaded, my goodness, this works. And then China copied. And because China was doing it, then India copied. So it spread right round East Asia. Right? So the process of imitation and learning from others, that's the process we're trying to ignite. And that is an attempt at changing the narrative. Right? So, sorry, that was a long answer, but it was a question which invited a long answer. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for being so brave to venture into other academic domain and bring it back to economics to inform it and to make it more whole. Thank you. We've needed that. Could you share a little bit more about what governments can do to develop really these restorative narratives? I think you said as coordinating action to overcome uncertainty. So in our very context of the of Europe across the continent, growing uncertainty, the EU is communicating a lot, less and less people relate to it. What are the opportunities for building this kind of compelling narrative on ethical capitalism, fair, single market?
Yeah, so I mean, the larger thesis of the future of capitalism is that capitalism periodically derails. It's the only system we've got that's capable of having continuous rises in mass living standards, but it doesn't work on autopilot. And I think capitalism's derailed about 3 times since it got going about 250 years ago. First was in the 1840s, then in the 1930s, and this one since the 1980s, when these 2 new divergences have emerged. Incidentally, both the spatial divergence and the educational divergence that began in around 1980 reversed the previous 200 years, during which those gaps had been narrowing, both spatial and educational. Right? So this is new. Something different happened the last 40 years. There's a lot that governments could do to heal those divides, a lot. And half the book is about what you can do, right? And so you have to buy it, right? Laura's got a copy somewhere. You can borrow.
Just on chapter 1.
Oh, right, okay. So there's a lot that governments can do. They need to work with other actors. So they need, for example, to change the law, certainly in Britain, to change the law so that firms are no longer required just to focus on profits, which is the legal structure at the moment in Britain. It's not as bad as that elsewhere. Britain is at the extreme end of the harshest form of capitalism. Until I wrote the book, I thought America was, but Britain's much worse. Right? So there's a whole load of things we could do. Given that I'm a pragmatist, I accept that none of these things come with guarantees that they'll work. Yeah? We have to try, and we have to learn as we go. Right? But what can we do politically? We need a commitment. We need something that is a bit dramatic, like Guggenheim, but it's not Bill Guggenheim everywhere, right? And here I turn to financial economics, so Laszlo will pick up on this one. Think what happened when the euro was in existential crisis in 2011, I guess. And what did the president of the European Central Bank say? Right? He said, I'm going to do whatever it takes. Right? And actually, having said, I'm going to do whatever it takes, he didn't have to do anything, because then immediately the markets calmed down. Right? Immediately. Why? What did that whatever it takes signal? First of all, it was his personal commitment. If the euro fell apart, once he'd said that, he'd lose his job. Right? There's no two ways about it. If the euro fell apart, having said that, you have to resign. Right? So, speculators and what have you knew that whatever powers he had, if necessary, he was going to use them. And then you start to say, well, what powers does he have? And actually, you don't know. Because like a lot of stuff in Europe, it's not fully specified, right? It's work in progress. Draghi didn't know. Right? Nobody knew, right, what precisely his powers were. But that was a plus. It just meant that he was going to push his powers to the limit, and because they were a bit vague, he'd probably push them over the limit a bit and see what happened. And that's what he did, right, eventually. But the power of his statement didn't depend on what he subsequently did. It worked immediately. So there was a narrative decisively changing things. We need the equivalent both in Britain and across Europe. And what is the equivalent? The equivalent is a commitment that whatever else we do, and however we do it, we are going to get spatial convergence. The poorer regions have got gradually to converge on the richer regions. If Europe means anything, it has to mean spatial convergence. And for the last 20 years, it's meant spatial divergence. Right? Germany has diverged from everywhere else, basically. Right? So we need a commitment like that, which is issued in a sufficiently unambiguous way by sufficiently powerful people that there's no walking away from it. That will then be the equivalent of the Guggenheim reset. People will be able to invest in the poorer regions confident that they're going to catch up.
Right. We have to leave it here, but maybe closing, you have one sentence as advice for the young economists before we go over for beer to reflect.
Oh yes.
On your
yes.
statements.
My advice, speaking as a very old and wise economist, 3 pieces of advice. 1, new ideas depend on escaping the network group. Right? Remember, the network group circulates the same bloody information so everybody thinks alike. Right? You will never generate new ideas if you just stay within the network group. Right? So escape your network group. Read outside it. Befriend people outside it. Right? 2, techniques of discovery are not the same as techniques of proof. You need both. But the sequence, if you're looking for new ideas, is first you need techniques of discovery. Right? Then you retrofit the techniques of proof, and it looks as if you've worked it out by proving, using all the apparatus. No, very few ideas come about like that, right? Let your hair down. Some of us have got less of it than you have, so you're lucky, But let what hair you've got down and see where it leads. You can't get away from techniques of proof, but the ideas, the initial ideas, are not formed through techniques of proof. 3rd and final, work on real problems and get to know the context. We all need to be pragmatists, and that starts with knowing the context of a real problem. Thanks.
So I would like to thank Professor Paul Collier and Professor Endor for this evening. I think we've deserved it. Belgian beers are waiting now. They're really cold, and food is ready also.